What if that time Rimuru was reincarnated as the Storm Dragon Sun Part 14, son of the Storm Dragon by Ashton K. 423. Ren Daisuke thought my unconventional life would end after years of working in special forces and CIA. So imagine my surprise when I was died and was reincarnated as a dragon of all things in this world filled with magic and monsters. This is the story of my adventures in the greatest journey of all time, under the new name Rimuru Tempest. Tensura AU Chapter 24, Nation Building. Jura Tempest Federation, Rimuru City. A month had passed since the war with the orcs and the monster summit. A month since the major species within the great forest of Jura had united under one banner, under the rule of the storm dragon's heir, Rimuru Tempest. It was a moment that would forever change the course of history. A lot had changed in the 4 weeks since the Jura Tempest Federation had been formed. For starters, construction in the 4 major towns was going pretty smoothly. The orcs were taking to their jobs with an almost overzealous commitment, so much so that Rimuru had to step in once or twice to prevent them from overworking themselves. Though he did understand that they were just trying to atone for all the damage they had done during the invasion and the homes they had destroyed. He appreciated the work ethic. He doubted that construction of the towns would have been as quick and smooth as it had been without the orcs' motivation. Rimuru just didn't want to overwork them too much. They weren't slaves or laborers. They were just as much members of the alliance as all the others. Thanks to the hard work of the orcs, the 4 major towns were coming along quite nicely, and almost every monster now had a roof over their heads. Thanks to Great Sage and the Dwarf Brothers, a plumbing system was also under construction. This would also help reduce any issues with hygiene and sanitation. The orcs weren't the only ones to contribute to the construction. Various other races had also chipped in, lending not only their strength, but their expertise as well. Rimuru particularly had races that were familiar with construction lead the forefront in the other 3 towns, such as the ogres from Akatsuki's village and the Tengu, while the Dwarf Brothers continued to lead the construction efforts in Rimuru City. All in all, things were turning out quite well, and everyone was settling into their new homes. It was a change from the life they were used to, but people seemed to be adjusting well enough. Another development was in regards to Tempest's agricultural development. Various minor settlements and villages had been established near the 4 major towns, with their main purpose being food production and animal husbandry. With the help of the elves and dryads, crop growth was going smoothly, and the nascent nation would be looking at its first harvest in the near future. A wide variety of food crops had already been planted, including rice, wheat, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, and a few other types of vegetables, grains, legumes, and even a few fruits. Though with some, they had to be careful of magicule poisoning, which rendered the crop poisonous. The bounty of the forest already provided much in terms of fruits and meat, which helped in terms of providing food for everyone. However, given the current numbers all round, it wasn't a sustainable method long-term. The magical fruits of the trees helped bridge the gap, and with one fruit being equivalent to a week's worth of nutritional meals, it was also effective. However, having a meal of magical fruits once a week was not a very encouraging idea. Hence, why farming and animal husbandry were so important. Speaking of animal husbandry, Rimuru had suggested the idea of capturing and inbreeding cow deers, horned rabbits, and razorbeaks, a D-rank chicken variant, and to actively breed and cultivate meat and dairy products within the forest. The cow deers were also a source of materials for crafting as well. Given these were monsters, even if they were low-level monsters, they would not be poisoned by magicules like ordinary animals would. Once they were shown the ropes, the practice of animal ranching became common in the minor villages spread around the forest. With this, the growing nation of Tempest was on its way to becoming self-sufficient. The power of botany. Aside from helping with the growth and cultivation of Tempest's food sources, Rimuru had also been working alongside Lore, a young elf with creamy skin, blonde hair, and green eyes. She had awakened a unique skill upon creating a soul corridor between the two of them, much like he had done with all the other elves. Lore's unique skill was called botany, a skill that possessed the subskills synthesis and separation, much like Rimuru's degenerate. But unlike degenerate, which could merge and divide matter, skills, and biological components, botany was strictly limited to plant life, meaning it only worked on botanical organic matter, not humans or animals or anything else. Regardless of this limitation, the application of such a skill on the agricultural front was almost limitless. And so, Rimuru had suggested she work on studying various plants and trying to separate and merge their properties, perhaps even creating new plant life by merging the properties of various plants and crops. Rimuru occasionally helped with these experiments when he could, but there was a lot of trial and error. Through their experimentation, they had managed to successfully fuse a few crops and fruits. Out of all the experiments they had done, only 3 had proven to be successful thus far. The rest, well, they produced less than desirable results. The plants would wither away, the fruit became poisonous or inedible, or other various disastrous results occurred. It turned out, putting together the right amount of properties from various plants was a lot harder than it looked on the surface. It was like putting together the right amount of chemicals to make a certain drug. The first result was the sunberry fruit, a fusion that came from synthesizing a sunflower and a strawberry. Though the sunflowers in Jura were far from natural, so there were a few unexpected but welcome results. The sunberry was a red, larger-than-average spherical berry with translucent skin and a golden internal glow. It grew in clusters from a large, vine-like plant. When eaten, it has a soft and juicy texture, and is for the most part sweet, with a slight nutty flavor inherited from the sunflower. The second successfully synthesized plant was a fusion of grape and lavender plants. This one was Lore's success, so Rimuru let her name the new plant, which she went on to call the vinard grape. Like most grapes, they grew on vines, except these vines had a hardy and wood-like texture, with slightly long and waxy leaves. The grapes themselves are a dark shade of purple, each covered with a fine silvery bloom that makes it glimmer in the sunlight. When the cluster is brushed or moved by wind or touch, it emits a calming, herbal, sweet fragrance. This fragrance also helps deter insects from the plant itself. The taste of the vinard grape is naturally sweet, but when bitten, the sweet taste is immediately followed by a soft, delicate floral finish. The grapes leave a pleasant and lingering aftertaste that is soothing, leaving the consumer in a slight sense of tranquility. This particular trait piqued Rimuru's interest, and he wondered if a refreshing and calming drink could be made from these fruits. The last successful fusion was by merging properties of rice plants and sugarcane. Finding rice in Jura had been a pleasant surprise, but the rice within the great forest turned black as a result of absorbing ambient magicules as it grew. This made it ideal for monsters to consume, but less than ideal for humans who could die from magicule poisoning. Synthesizing the rice and sugarcane resulted in a new crop Rimuru called sweetstem rice, or sweet rice. The first batch planted greatly resembled a normal paddy of rice, but the plants stand taller and more robust. The stalk is visibly thicker, more rigid, and has a gold-green hue to it. The rice grains grow near the top and have a sugary, crystalline color that sheens in direct sunlight. A field of nearly ripe sweet rice emits a sweet and grassy scent. When cooked, the rice grains are plump, slightly sticky, and have a natural gentle sweetness. It went well with spicy dishes and herbs, and the potential use in desserts was something Rimuru was also looking forward to. Another interesting idea was the prospect of brewing a unique, potent, and naturally sweet sake from sweet rice. It was a small but decent start. Rimuru would be relying on Lore a lot more for the agricultural innovation of Tempest, and while he would occasionally chip in and help when he could, he also had other responsibilities that needed to be attended to. He looked forward to any other creations that she would be able to come up with. It would serve not only to boost the diversity of Tempest's crops, but could even be used for external trade, since these crops would be unique to Jura and its environment. While he had held back on tampering with magical plants for the time being, Rimuru was also looking forward to how plants like hippocute herbs and the treant fruits would react when merged with other plants, especially considering the hippocute's healing properties and the treant fruit's non-perishability. Honestly, the possibilities of botany were as limitless as the number of plants and crops that were out there. And the ironic part about that was, the more plants she created from the skill, the more possibilities became available all in all. The otherworlders. On another note, another interesting development that had happened in the forest during Rimuru's absence was the arrival of two humans. More specifically, two otherworlders like himself. The first being Rito Hanakawa, a young teen who had been transported from his world and into the great forest of Jura. The boy had become a resident of the goblin village since his migration, and was currently staying with Kataki and training under him, another surprising revelation given the evil goblin's character. The other guest was a teen girl of around the same age called Sumir Makino. She had appeared in the forest around the same time the Dryad's domain was attacked, and was from the heavenly kingdom of Angelus, a small nation within Sky Queen Frey's domain. Their contribution in the battle had proved to be invaluable. Rito's supporter helped the assault team work well together, boosting their physical and magical abilities and even healing them, while Sumir's overcomer allowed her to fight on the front lines beside Shin. Had the Orc Lord not evolved into the Orc disaster, their victory would have been all but assured. And so, though it was much later than he would have liked, Rimuru made sure to make time to speak with the two of them a few days after the war with the Orcs, a meeting that turned out to be more revealing than he had thought it would be. Flashback 3 days after the Orc War. Rimuru was seated in a cottage near the center of the expanding goblin town. It was his designated office for the time being while the town's administrative building was underway. In front of him were a stack of wooden plates of projects that needed to be signed off on. Given the events 3 days ago and the sudden changes that were taking place, it's safe to say that it was a lot. Lord Rimuru. Rimuru was pulled from his work by a knock to the door, followed by the familiar voice of Shin calling out from the other side. "Come in," he replied as he sat up straight. He had asked Shin to bring him some very important guests that he'd been meaning to meet since the night of the Orc invasion. But with the many things that had been demanding his attention since the formation of the Rimuru Tempest Federation, he hadn't had much time to meet them. The door opened and in walked Shin, with the two figures of Rito and Sumir following close behind her. The two of them seemed rather tense and nervous as they walked in. Rimuru assumed it was because of him, either because of his status as the leader of the nation, or as the son of the Storm Dragon. "Lord Rimuru, I've brought the guests that you requested," Shin said with a bright smile and a nod, like a child waiting to be praised for completing a task. "Yes, thank you, Shin," Rimuru said with an appreciative nod. "Do you mind giving us the room? I'd like to talk to them alone." He went on to say, to which Shin responded with a nod before stepping out of the room, making sure to close the door behind her and give the three of them privacy. Once the three of them were alone, Rimuru turned his attention to the two humans in the room, which served to make them even more nervous. When Rimuru spoke again, he tried to appear as disarming as possible. "Though it's later than I would have preferred, I'm glad to finally have the chance to talk with the two of you privately. My name is Rimuru Tempest, leader of the recently formed Jura Tempest Federation." "Why, you've been wanting to speak with us?" Rito asked with a gulp. The boy was literally sweating up a bucket at this point. "Yes, though not for the reasons you're probably thinking," Rimuru said with a disarming smile. "Why don't you two take a seat? It beats standing the whole time." The two of them took him up on his offer and sat down on the two chairs opposite Rimuru. First things first, I wanted to thank both of you for lending your aid to the people of this forest. From what I was told, the battle against the Orc Lord would have turned out very differently without your aid, Rimuru said, wanting to make it clear to these kids that he had no ill intentions towards them. We didn't really do much in the end, though, Sumer said with a small frown. That's not what I heard, but regardless, I'm grateful for both of you choosing to help, Rimuru said once more with a nod, to which Sumer and Rito also nodded, their postures relaxing slightly. You know, for a monster boss, you're a lot more easygoing than I thought you'd be, Rito said with a nervous laugh as he rubbed the back of his head. While Sumer would have chosen her words a lot more carefully, she couldn't help but nod her head in agreement. That's because, like you two, I'm also an otherworlder, Rimuru admitted, much to the shock of the other two. Wait, what? Rito almost shouted as he leaned forward on his chair. How is that even possible? I've never heard of a human being reincarnated as a monster before. Sumer pondered, her reaction less explosive and even a little skeptical. My name was Ren Daisuke, a Japanese-born citizen that traveled to America for military work. I was killed by gunfire during a particular mission, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in this body, Rimuru explained as he reverted back to his dragon hatchling form and landed on the table. He didn't think it necessary to go in-depth on his former profession. As teenagers, these two most likely wouldn't get much of that jargon. If you need more proof, you can ask me questions about our world. I was reincarnated about a year ago, so my knowledge should be pretty fresh. That isn't necessary, Sumer said. The fact that he knew about guns had sold her. To her knowledge, guns hadn't been developed yet in this world. The people of this world tended to use traditional weapons rather than modern firearms. The fact that he knew about both Japan and America also helped. It's just still surprising. I've thought about that a few times actually, humans reincarnating into monsters. I highly doubt I'm the first, but given the way this world functions, it wouldn't be far-fetched for there to have been others, only for them to die or be killed, Rimuru said with a thoughtful expression. After all, the world of monsters is far more unforgiving than that of humans. Actually, I think that just applies to this world in general. I can testify to that. Within seconds of me arriving in this place, I was suddenly attacked by a monster. I thought for sure I was going to die, Rito said with an exasperated sigh as he leaned back into his chair. Rimuru nodded his head in understanding. He had been filled in on the details by Kataki. A part of him was still surprised that Rito had managed to worm his way into Kataki's closed space. Kataki had pretty much isolated himself since coming to the goblin town, especially when he learned that the goblins were coexisting with the wolves that had destroyed his home. But from what Rimuru had heard, Kataki and Rhea had worked well together in the recent war. Perhaps Rito's proximity had allowed Kataki to warm up a bit. Rimuru wasn't sure, but he was curious as to where it would go. So what happens now? Rito asked, his nerves returning a bit. Since his arrival, he had been allowed to stay in the goblin town, but he knew that whether he was allowed to stay was ultimately up to Rimuru. That is completely up to the two of you. After what you did for us, you're both welcome to stay here as long as you like, Rimuru said with a nod. If there's anything specific, feel free to ask me. Both Rito and Sumer seemed to relax when he said that. If that's the case, Sumer started as her face took on a rather nervous expression. Rimuru could feel the anxiety coming from her as she tried to find the right words. Would you mind if I asked about the whereabouts of the storm dragon Velredia? The temperature in the room seemed to drop slightly when Sumer asked. Rimuru's expression or composure did not change in the slightest. He still seemed welcoming and hospitable. But if one looked closely enough, they could tell he had become guarded. I'd have to ask why you want to know that information first, Rimuru stated as he reverted back into his human form and took his seat. He leaned forward on his desk, his attention focused solely on Sumer, which made the young warrior squirm slightly. He could tell through desire that she didn't have any ill intentions. Great sage, even confirmed as much. But the information she was asking for was rather sensitive. If word got out the storm dragon was within his stomach, he would become a target of all the people his mother had made an enemy out of. He already had enough to deal with just by being her son. Not that it was a bad thing, but he wasn't willing to paint a bigger target on his back by revealing her location. Well, Sumair hesitated for a moment, an equally conflicted and pained expression passing her face before she took a deep breath, gathering her resolve and lifting her head to meet Rimuru's eyes once more. The truth is, I wasn't sent on a mission to investigate the awakening of the Orc Lord. I actually ran away from home, Sumair confessed as her eyes fell down to her lap. Ran away? Why? Rito asked in surprise. Rimuru kept quiet, though equally curious as to her reasoning. 4 years ago, my father and I were suddenly summoned into this world, Sumair started. We found ourselves in a small nation of people that worshipped angels. Angels? Rimuru repeated, his interest piqued. Yes, they even have an angel corpse that they revered and worshipped. Well, that's not creepy at all, Rito said sarcastically with a disgusted expression. Rimuru had to agree that it was weird. When we first came into this world, the first thing I wanted was to go home. To my friends, my life, my mother, Sumair said as she clenched her hands, a pained expression on her face. But my father, he was captivated by this world and how different it was from Earth. Rather than looking for a way back, he began to look more into this world, its creatures, its history. The more he learned about this world and how it was governed by power, the more he began to covet and desire power for himself. He learned about how the heroes and demon lords of this world came to be, but his research eventually led him to the apex beings of this world, the ultimate species, true dragons. Rimuru couldn't help but frown the more he heard. It was the typical downfall of a great man into an obsessed tyrant. He already had a bad feeling that the kingdom of Angelus was going to be bad news, not just for him, but for his nation too. When he learned of the world-altering power of the true dragons, he decided he would take it for himself. And so, he gathered support and followers. Given how quickly he rose to power, I suspect it had something to do with his unique skill. He quickly assumed the throne and renamed the nation, the Heavenly Kingdom of Angelus, after his own name and the angels the locals worshipped. Sumair continued to explain. He began to do his own research on the angels, especially the corpse the people worshipped, and eventually managed to harness its power for himself. I'm not sure to what extent, but it was enough that the people of Angelus began to revere him as some god or chosen one. You said you ran away from home from your father. Why? Rimuru asked. He already had a feeling as to what the answer was. It was clear as day, but a part of him, small and illogical, really hoped he was wrong. Much like he did with the corpse of the angel, my father wants to make the power of the storm dragon his own. He wanted to take advantage of the fact that it was sealed and weakened in order to capture it and siphon its power. Once he did, he would become the most powerful individual in this world, a true god. I ran so I could try and warn the storm dragon of his plan, perhaps even find a way to stop him, Sumair confessed. Rimuru could tell that Sumair was being truthful via desire and thought reading. Each word of her tale had been nothing but the truth. She really had left home in an attempt to warn his mother and stop her father. Still, the news in itself was worrying. Angelus had the backing of a whole nation, small as it was, and the drive to seek out his ambitions. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. If he truly was set on obtaining the Storm Dragon's power, then war between the Heavenly Kingdom and the Monster Federation was inevitable. No offense, Sumair, but your father sounds insane. Even if he found the Storm Dragon, how would he gain her power without potentially breaking the seal and her going on a rampage? And if she was in a weakened state, how would he gain enough power to become a god? Rito asked in bafflement, with Rimuru mentally agreeing with him. There were a lot of flaws and risks in what was already an insane plan, and Rimuru didn't want to find out the answer. I don't know. What I do know is that my father isn't the man he used to be before we came here. He's become obsessed with gaining power and will do anything it takes to get it, Sumer bitterly acknowledged before looking at Rimuru. That's why it's important that I warn the storm dragon. I don't doubt the power of the true dragons, but as stupid as his goal is, my father is no fool. If he goes after her, it'll be with a plan in mind. You don't need to worry about your father acquiring my mother's power. My mother did, in fact, vanish shortly after I came into this world. And while she will eventually return one day, it won't be for some time, Rimuru replied, which wasn't wrong, but obviously wasn't the whole story. Rimuru could tell Sumer was completely honest the entire time, but still felt the need to keep his mother's true whereabouts hidden. So he decided to play on the official story and the common knowledge of true dragons reforming after temporarily dying instead. Regardless, I am grateful to you for what you've done. I know it couldn't have been easy, betraying your father like that. It wasn't an easy choice to make, but it was one I felt was right, Sumer said with a bittersweet smile. However, even so, I doubt it will stop my father's ambitions. Especially if he learns that the storm dragon had a child, there is a chance that you could become a target, a substitute, while he waits for the storm dragon's return. So there's a chance he could come after me instead, Rimuru said with a frown. He wasn't surprised to hear this. Considering he had inherited his mother's true dragon magic, it made sense that Angelus would target him. Afraid so. I know that he also took an interest and looked into Charybdis a lot when he learned that it was a spawn of the storm dragon. So there's a chance he could target it as well, Sumer revealed. Charybdis, a calamity-class monster that had been sealed away. A monster born as a result of his mother unleashing an excessive amount of magicules, only for those magicules to gather and become a terrifying monster. A monster without will or sentience, and thus could do nothing but leave destruction wherever it traveled. Trainee and the Dryads were the only ones who knew where the monster was sealed from what he had gathered. Rimuru had yet to visit the site himself. If Charybdis really was a potential target for Angelus, then Rimuru would need to ask the Dryads to keep a closer eye on its seal for the foreseeable future. I see. Thank you, Sumer, for bringing this information to me, Rimuru said with an appreciative nod. Sumer had risked and given up a lot to try and get this information to his mother. Rimuru could respect the courage and strength it took to leave behind your only family in a strange new world, so long as it meant doing the right thing. Given your situation, you're more than welcome to take refuge here for as long as you'd like, or until you decide on what you want to do next. It's the least I can do after everything you've done and risked. Really? Then if it's all right, I'd like to stay here for the time being, Sumer said happily with a relieved exhale. She had initially planned to head for Ingracia after doing what she needed to do, but the idea of staying here in Tempest didn't seem so bad either. I'll help out in any way I can, so you can count on me. The same applies to you as well, Rito. You're welcome to stay here as you have been, Rimuru said with a nod towards Rito before addressing both of them. But don't forget that you're human. You have a lot more options in terms of deciding what you want to do with your lives and where you want to go. So I won't hold it against you if you decide to leave at some point. Thank you, I'll think about that last part. But for the time being, I think I'm going to stick around. Continue my training with Kataki and get stronger and more experienced before going out there, Rito said with a nod of his own. There was still much he didn't know about this world when compared to Sumer or Rimuru. He wanted to learn more, get stronger, and become someone even Kataki would be proud of before setting off on his own journey, wherever that journey took him. End of flashback. Following their conversation, as promised, the two were allowed to stay within Rimuru City, so long as they followed the rules and did not cause trouble, though this did go both ways. Over the last month, Rito continued his training under Kataki and the occasional help read, torture from Hakuryu as well. Thanks to Rido's influence and pestering, Kataki was also slowly opening up to the Tempest wolves. Fighting alongside Rhea in the war must have had a bigger impact than Rimuru had initially assumed. It wasn't a clean slate, but rather a slowly healing wound. As for Sumire, she had also settled nicely since deciding to stay. Sumire got along surprisingly well with Shuna, Shin, Sauka, and the other female dragoons, and certain other monsters like the other Kijin of Akatsuki's village and the Tengu. She often sparred and trained with them to refine her skills and her arts, though Hakuryu didn't take it any easier with her than with anyone else. Occasionally, she helps with Rido's training as well, offering a human perspective to help him develop his own abilities. The three of them occasionally met once or twice a week when Rimuru had spare time. More often than not, they would discuss their old world, and Rimuru even expressed his desire to introduce things from there into his nation. Rido and Sumire also seemed eager to contribute and share some of their own ideas, and Rimuru welcomed the fresh outside perspective. Some were simple things like food dishes, though Great Sei indicated that some would require more refinement or certain resources to recreate. One suggestion that Sumire particularly insisted on was onsen-style hot spring baths, claiming they were good not only for hygiene and easing fatigue or stress, but also for improving morale and bonding amongst different races. She guaranteed him that it would surely be popular among the female populace. Rimuru, not opposed to the idea, actually saw the additional benefits of making a potential tourist attraction in the future. But realistically, he understood that it would have to wait for the time being. Most of the current construction efforts were mainly focused on housing their large population. But still, setting up a hot spring would definitely become a priority once their foundation was set. Another thing that had occurred in the last month was the search and acquisition of a few more subordinates by Rimuru. After seeing how effective his sticky steel thread had been as a resource material back in his time in the ogre village, especially considering how he could imbue the material with one of his resistances for enhanced durability, Rimuru decided to actually seek out monsters that could create said materials en masse. Naturally, he sought out the monster that had granted him the ability in the first place, a black spider. He returned to the deepest parts of the sealed cave. Although he had devoured all the monsters in the cave on the way out, the magicule saturation in the cave was still extremely high, more than enough to spawn a few new monsters. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for in one of the caverns. The process had been rather simple. Flare his aura, trap the spider, and force it to submit. He had to resort to such brutish methods due to it being less of an intellectual species, but it certainly was faster and more efficient. After he was sure it would listen, he named the black spider Mia. The black spider Mia, already an A-rank monster, evolved into a black widow. Its arachnid form grew larger, its exoskeleton becoming thicker and more durable. From the front, where its head was supposed to be, the upper body of a humanoid female sprouted. Her skin was pale like ash, with multiple crimson-red eyes and shoulder-length black, smooth hair. Mia's evolution resulted in her growth into the upper tiers of A-rank, and surprisingly, the awakening of a consciousness. Though she still had much to learn before she could actually be called intelligent, she had made significant progress in the few weeks since she joined Tempest. Having inherited a few of his resistances and sticky steel thread, her thread was already proving invaluable. Aside from Mia, Rimuru had also subdued and named a Gehenna moth and a hell moth. Their silk was extremely durable and magic conductive. Naming and evolving them only made it even more so. This further increased the quality of clothing and armor that his people wore, along with ensuring they had a steady supply to rely on. But aside from them, there was one more target that Rimuru had been chasing over the last month, a target that was more elusive than the rest. The Queen of the Hive. Rimuru was riding on top of Ranga in his human form, the two of them slowly and quietly moving through a densely forested area within Jura. Over the last month, Rimuru, at the suggestion of Great Sage, had been searching for ants all over the forest. But not just any ant. No, that would be far too easy. His real target was the Ant Queen. According to Great Sage, all the giant ants within the great forest of Jura served one ant queen. They weren't multiple colonies, but rather one massive interconnected colony originating from one queen. If Rimuru could subdue the ant queen, then he would have a sizable workforce and an ant army under him. Giant ants were on average B-rank monsters, with some being higher. But Rimuru wasn't really interested in their capabilities on the battlefield, but rather how they could be integrated into the nation's growth and development. Anyone with an understanding of insects understood that ants were among the most organized and structured creatures on Earth. Each ant did its task efficiently, and they all worked together like a well-oiled machine. If the same applied in this world, then adding them to his labor force would be nothing short of beneficial. It would reduce the workload and burden that the orcs had put on themselves, something Rimuru had tried to talk to Geld about, but there was only so much he could do even as a leader. The problem, however, was that trying to pinpoint the exact location of the Ant Queen's nest was trickier than they thought. Rimuru and Ranga had spent the last 4 days, in particular, in trying to find it, only for all the prior attempts to be dead ends. The nests they found were just extensions of the colony, but none of them were truly the core where the queen laid. But now, things had changed, as Rimuru had managed to pinpoint the location of the Ant Queen's nest, which is where he and Ranga were approaching right now, their presence concealed to avoid being detected too early. Any wrong move and the queen would be alerted, which might result in her fleeing underground or attacking them. While he was sure he and Ranga could handle themselves if necessary, he wanted to meet the Ant Queen without resorting to conflict. Fighting would only reduce the likelihood of the Ant Queen joining him, even via subjugation, but it would also result in the unnecessary losses of the very labor force he was trying to acquire. From what Great Sage had told him, an Ant Queen was capable of gaining knowledge and intelligence through the prey it devoured, meaning, said queen might even have human-level intellect if she's eaten a human before. A larger colony represented a more intelligent and powerful queen, and given there was only one ant queen in the whole great forest of Jura, then Rimuru knew he would be dealing with a smarter-than-average insect. Rimuru and Ranga soon arrived at the entrance of the Ant Queen's nest, located at the bottom of a cliff, a tunnel that went underground. While he couldn't see beyond the mouth of the cave, Rimuru could without a doubt sense the higher amount of magical energy when compared to the other ant nests. This is definitely the spot, but I'm sensing other high-level signatures aside from the queen's, Rimuru thought as he expanded his magic sense. Notice, it is likely that the queen's domain may hold a wider and more powerful variant of the ant species. So, basically soldier ants and her own personal guards. Affirmative. That makes sense. If the giant ants can be considered worker ants, then there are bound to be soldier ants as well. At best they are on the lower end of A rank, meaning it shouldn't be a problem for Ranga and I either way. But the queen, even from his position far from the nest's mouth, he could sense the presence of the queen quite clearly. Her magic energy was no doubt on par or even higher than Ranga's. Notice, this will not be a problem. The Ant Queen's high magic energy is a result of her body being built to produce multiple offspring. As a result, despite its large magical energy, its combat capabilities are in fact quite low. I see. It made sense. In a world where monsters had to give up their own magicules just to reproduce, it made sense that some creatures would adapt their bodies accordingly. The queen's purpose was to ensure the survival of the colony. Nothing else mattered beyond that. And in turn, the colony had a responsibility to guard their queen with their lives. "Master, how should we proceed?" Ranga whispered, the two of them still hidden with their presence concealed. Rimuru took a moment to ponder. Sneaking into the cave would require way more effort than he was willing to put into this. While he wanted to negotiate and acquire the ant's loyalty peacefully, he also wasn't beyond using force if necessary. In the end, Rimuru decided to just be blunt and go for it. "Stay here, Ranga," Rimuru said as he jumped off the alpha wolf's back, petting him on the head and walking out of their cover and into the open. He calmly approached the mouth of the cave before stopping a few meters in front of it. What he was about to do would either flush out the ant queen or drive her deeper underground, but he was hoping that it would be the former. With a deep breath, followed by an exhale, Rimuru unleashed a significant amount of his aura. The air around him exploded as a constant stream of magic energy and pressure was unleashed. All monsters and animals within the vicinity fled in the opposite direction. But as he had hoped, the rapid, creepy crawling sound of insects moving was rapidly approaching the cave's mouth. Within moments, a horde of large red ants was flowing out the cave. The giant ants stopped a short distance from him, clearly wary and aware of how outclassed they were despite their low intelligence. And yet, despite that, they still stood in his way, blocking his path into the ant nest. Most likely, they were just here to stall for time so the queen could retreat into the deeper tunnels of the nest and escape. "I don't have time to waste on you. Bring me your queen," Rimuru stated calmly. The ants merely growled before preparing to charge forward. If nothing else, Rimuru had to respect their resolve to die for their queen. He brought his hand to his blade as one of the red ants began to charge. However, "Stop," a surprisingly gentle and feminine voice echoed through Rimuru's head, bringing him to a halt before he could draw his blade. However, he wasn't the only one who stopped. Even the giant red ants seemed to stop their charge and drop their hostility altogether. Suddenly, the ants began to move, parting ways and creating a clear path to the mouth of the cave. For a moment, Rimuru thought he was supposed to walk in, but was proven wrong. 5 slightly larger ants came out the mouth of the cave. These ants were not only larger than the standard giant ants, but their bodies were white in color as opposed to the usual red of their smaller counterparts, and they had a significantly stronger presence. No doubt they were A rank at the very least and were clearly built for combat, judging by their tougher exoskeletons and sharper mandibles. "So these are the ants I sensed earlier." "Affirmative. These are white ants, a variant of the giant ant bred by the queen for the sole purpose of protecting her and disposing of any perceived threat." For a moment, Rimuru assumed that this meant the white ants were sent to fight him in place of the giant ants, but that thought was soon thrown out when the white ants also parted and gave way. From behind them came an even larger ant that stood at least 3 times larger than the giant ants. It was also white in color, and had a rather large abdomen that stood out compared to the rest of its body. Rimuru could tell just from its presence alone that this was the ant queen. "Strong one, what business do you have with my people?" The gentle, feminine voice from before echoed within his head once more. Rimuru quickly realized that it was actually coming from the ant queen. Was this how she communicated? Answer: the ant queen communicates through thought communication, due to her mouth being incapable of verbally sounding syllables in the same manner as humans. That makes sense, Rimuru thought before turning his attention to the ant queen once more. "My name is Rimuru Tempest, son of the storm dragon Rimuru Tempest. I've come seeking you out. I want you and your kin to join my nation," Rimuru said firmly as his eyes met those of the ant queen. For a moment, there was silence as the two of them simply stared at one another, neither saying anything. The ant queen hadn't reacted to the revelation of his heritage, which meant she either already knew or wasn't the type to be easily impressed. Rimuru was tempted to use thought reading, just to hear what she was thinking, but decided against it. "And if I were to refuse?" the ant queen asked. She was prodding him. "Then I'll give you 2 options. 1, you and your colony relocate out of the great forest of Jura, or 2, you die by my hand," Rimuru stated bluntly, without hesitation. "Your colony is by far the single largest united force prior to me forming my nation, but now that makes it more of a threat than anything." Another moment of silence passed. While what he said wasn't entirely false, it wasn't entirely true either. He doubted the ants would have been a significant threat in any situation. He had a lot of high-ranking monsters under him spread out in every major town. The biggest issue was their numbers. This ant queen controlled hundreds of thousands of ants spread out across the whole forest, which in itself was absurd. Under the right circumstances, she could do a lot of damage, and after the orc invasion, Rimuru just wasn't willing to take the risk of letting her roam free. It was a petty reason, but one he felt was validated. "Very well," the Ant Queen finally said as she lowered her head. "I, Queen of the Ants, willingly bow down and accept you, Rimuru Tempest, as my lord and master." "Really?" Rimuru was kind of shocked at how quickly she had submitted to him. He couldn't even sense any anger, hesitation, or doubts coming from her through desire. She was perfectly calm despite the situation, and that, in its own way, was more unnerving. "Do not be mistaken. I am not pleased with this situation, but I have lived and reigned long enough to understand the workings of this world. The strong devour the weak. Surrendering to you is the most natural and reasonable course to ensure the survival of my colony," the Queen explained. This must be what great sage meant when she said the Ant Queen can gain knowledge and sentience through devouring other beings. If she'd lived as long as she was implying, then it was no wonder she was so smart for an insect. "Regardless, thank you for your cooperation," Rimuru said sincerely with a nod. "To mark you as my subordinate, I'd like to give you a name. That is, if you don't mind." "I'd be honored," she said as she closed her eyes and waited. Rimuru stepped forward and placed his hand on her large head. "From today onwards you will be known as Regina." As soon as he uttered the name, a large amount of magicules flowed out of him and into the Ant Queen. Her massive form began to glow and surprisingly began to shrink too. After a moment, the glow faded, and gone was the large insect form. In its place was a humanoid monster. Regina's body now stood at approximately 58 feet. Her outer body was composed entirely of her white exoskeleton, but with a visibly feminine figure. She had 2 antennas coming out from her forehead, and her black eyes seemed sharper and more focused. Surprisingly, her magicules didn't grow as much as I thought they would, but her current form definitely is stronger. Rimuru pondered. While there was some growth in power, Regina was still within the realm of special A rank with a slight improvement. Answer: this is because the individual Regina did not go through an evolution, but rather a form of metamorphosis, allowing her to freely transition between her previous matriarchal form and her current state, which can be oriented for combat with training. It is also expected that any offspring she has going forward will be significantly stronger. Cool, so she can alternate forms and still expand her colony. Rimuru thought in approval. Rimuru couldn't wait to see just what kind of ants Regina would bring into Tempest going forward. Following the acquisition of the Ant Queen, now named Regina, Rimuru took her back to Rimuru City. As knowledgeable as she was, there was still much she did not know about when it came to life on the surface. As an ant, her life had been underground, managing and directing her colony. But now that she was under Rimuru, a lot would be changing for her and her colony. But loath as he was to admit it, Rimuru wasn't the best at playing chauffeur. The two of them entered Tempest's government building, a large, ongoing structure that was going to be the heart of the nation's politics. It was currently the nation's largest building despite being incomplete. It didn't take them long to reach Rimuru's office. He opened the door and walked in. It was a large, spacious room with a large, well-furnished desk and chair by the window. In the center of the room was a low table between 2 couches. There were a few decorations in the room, such as flowers. A small smile crept onto his face as he saw none other than Shuna seated on one of the guest chairs of his desk, with stacks of papers in front of her. Shuna, his wife. The thought still baffled him after 3 weeks of marriage. Was this what they called the honeymoon phase? Shuna had been a godsend as far as his administrative and diplomatic duties were concerned. Having been a military man in his last life, Rimuru wasn't really quite the best when it came to formal audiences and addressing big crowds. But Shuna took to all that like a fish in water. She really was a princess who'd become a queen. "Welcome back," Shuna greeted as she stood up from the table and turned to him with a smile. She then noticed Regina standing behind him. "It looks like you were successful this time around." "Yeah, it took a bit, but we finally located the Ant Queen's nest. Meet Regina, the queen of Jura's ant colony." Rimuru introduced as he gestured to the Ant Queen, before turning to Regina and gesturing to Shuna. "Regina, this is my wife, Shuna Tempest." "It's an honor to meet you, my lady," Regina greeted as she bowed her head in respect for her master's consort. "The honor's mine. I'm glad to have you and your people join us. I'm sure we'll get along swimmingly," Shuna said with a welcoming smile. "Did anything of note happen while I was out?" Rimuru asked. Someone would have reached him through thought communication in the event of an emergency, but he still felt the need to ask. "No, nothing worth mentioning, though there are a few papers that require your explicit approval," Shuna said. "I separated them from the rest for you." "Thank you," Rimuru said with a smile as he approached her and planted a kiss on her cheek. "Why don't you let me take over the paperwork for a bit? You're probably tired of sitting all morning." I don't mind," Shuna said as her cheeks reddened slightly at the gesture of affection. It seemed Rimuru wasn't the only one that was still adjusting to their new married life. "I insist. Besides, I was hoping you could show Regina around town and stuff. She's not used to life on the surface," Rimuru explained as he gestured to the Ant Queen, who was looking at the two of them with mild interest, not used to seeing displays of affection, though her gaze quickly fell respectfully when their eyes turned to her. "Of course, leave it to me," Shuna said with a short bow before leading Regina out of the office. She stopped by the door and turned to Rimuru once more. "Should I have someone bring you some refreshments?" "Yes, please," Rimuru responded as he leaned back into his seat. He hadn't realized it until Shuna asked, but he was actually a bit thirsty from all the searching and wandering through the forest. Guess that just went to show how attentive his wife was, something he greatly appreciated. "Right, I'll have someone bring it over then," Shuna said with a bright smile, before walking out and closing the door behind her, leaving Rimuru to the isolated silence of his office. Rimuru took a moment, leaning back in his seat to simply breathe, before leaning forward and facing the papers in front of him. Thankfully, Shuna had already organized the documents that needed his immediate attention. But if there was one thing that Rimuru was learning about being a king, it's that paperwork sucked. He remembered having to write mission reports and other documents in his previous life, which he didn't enjoy either, but somehow this was 100 times worse. Thankfully, he had Shuna as well as Akatsuki and Keed to help with much of the unnecessary paperwork, with one being his wife and the other two being his advisors, not to mention Akatsuki being his father-in-law. Rimuru was more than comfortable enough to delegate tasks to them. He trusted their judgment. As it stood, a system was slowly falling into place. Most of the logistics and information gathering was organized by Akatsuki and Keed. They received the reports and requests from the various projects happening all over town. That information would then be brought to his office, and Shuna would then filter and organize the papers based on priority, bringing the most critical ones to his attention. In an ironic kind of way, Shuna was like his chief of staff. "All right, let's get to it," Rimuru said to himself. He sat up straight, taking a second to stretch his arms before starting his paperwork. The shadows of Jura. A few days later, around midday, Rimuru decided to meet up with Saoi and his subordinates. Since the formation of the Rimuru Tempest Federation, Saoi had become Rimuru's head of intelligence, responsible for all covert ops and intelligence gathering of the world around them. The division was still growing and had high recruitment expectations, as one would expect from Saoi, but the results thus far were nothing Rimuru could complain about. And so, he allowed Sao free rein over how he ran them, recruitment, training, and all. They had even begun to operate internationally to some extent. Rimuru had Sao and a select few infiltrate some of the smaller, less protected nations of the West, with the goal of acquiring information on various forms of martial arts, weaponry, and magic. The reason being, while many of the monsters in Jura were sentient and even wielded weapons, many of them didn't have any form of formal training or developed styles. Instead, it was just a matter of passing down one's own experiences without formalizing it into a fighting style. The only ones to do this were the ogres and Tengu, who formerly learned the way of the sword and certain other arts from Byakuya Araki. Taking the various martial arts and techniques of humans, and then building upon them, would be much better than actually starting from ground zero. The Hei's style was a deadly sword style, but it wasn't for everyone, nor did Rimuru want it to be the only practice of his nation. Aside from that, they had also been using these smaller nations to gather information on the other Western powers and to gain a better understanding of their strength. For the time being, Rimuru held back on attempting to infiltrate any major powers or demon lord territories. No doubt they would have a way to detect monsters. However, the reason he was here today was completely different. Among the requirements to enter Sao's division, a few of them included the ability to use the arts form hide and flash step, and to have the skill shadow movement. Anyone who wanted to join underwent the necessary training to acquire these abilities. Only when they reached a level of proficiency satisfying Sao were they allowed to join his division. "I've gotta say, Sao, you're a real slave driver," Rimuru commented. He and Sao stood on the side, watching the training of the new recruits aiming to join the division after the Federation's formation. "I feel they must be able to do at least this much to be of use to you, my lord," Sao replied, his voice ever calm and confident. "Besides, our tasks will prove to be more dangerous and more demanding as the nation grows. In the end, even this much training might prove to be insufficient." Perhaps. Rimuru couldn't help but agree with him, at least partially. The world beyond Jura was still unknown in many ways, mainly because the monster tribes of the forest very rarely interacted with the outside world. Those that did leave often didn't return for one reason or another. There was still much to learn. Key details about other nations, the goals of their rulers, individuals who could pose a threat to Tempest, and the kind of defenses other nations had. This was all information that Sao and his division would be responsible for acquiring. They would be thrust into the heart of the enemy, risking their lives with every operation. With that in mind, Rimuru could accept Sao's intense training requirements. It was also the reason why Rimuru had come today, to make some contributions of his own. "But that's also the reason why I'm here today," Rimuru said with a smirk. He turned to Sao, prompting the Kijin to look at him in minor curiosity, though one would never be able to tell just by looking at his face alone. "My lord," Sao questioned. "In the last month, I've also been working on a few techniques that I thought may prove useful to you and your subordinates, in particular, those related to the power of darkness and shadows," Rimuru stated, unable to hide the pride in his voice. "Why don't you hold the drills for now and call everyone over? It'll be easier to demonstrate." "Right away, my lord," Sao said, as he instantly vanished from his side. The shadow arts. In about 4 minutes, all 50 or so of Sao's subordinates were gathered to the side, while Sao himself stood in front of Rimuru. He would have Sao create body doubles to serve as targets for the skills he was about to demonstrate. One thing that Rimuru had learned early on was that skills were not so easily acquired. The higher the rank of the skill, the more effort was needed to actually acquire it. Common skills, for instance, were the easiest, usually dependent on simple practice. Extra skills, on the other hand, required regular practice and a certain degree of effort. And then there were unique skills, which were, according to great sage, based on one's spiritual strength, character, and strong desires. Rimuru had a much easier time than most due to the incredible strength of his soul. He was reborn in this world with his personality and memories fully intact and had 3 unique skills from the start, each of which made skill acquisition even easier. But other individuals weren't always so fortunate. Rimuru had taken that knowledge and decided to make his own attempt at creating skills based on his knowledge from manga and animations. For Saoi's group, he took inspiration from his shadow movement, and after a lot of trial and error, managed to create, or rather, recreate, 3 skills. All right, listen up everybody. What I'm about to show you are skills I developed specifically for this group. It took some effort to create them, but you all should have a much easier time acquiring them than I did, Rimuru explained. The subordinates fell into awe at his ability to develop new abilities. The reason Rimuru was confident in their ability was thanks in part to Gluttony's food chain, which was composed of receive and provide. Under normal circumstances, his subordinates would instantly receive certain compatible skills upon being named. But provide also made it much easier for his subordinates to acquire any skill Rimuru himself already possessed with a lot less effort. "Saoi, if you would," Rimuru said. The blue-haired Kijin instantly manifested a body double. Rimuru brought his hands together with his index finger sticking out. To the shock of his audience, his shadow expanded, stretching and moving like a serpent until it connected to the body double. The double's movements were instantly restricted. The first skill is called Shadow Possession. It's a skill that allows you to bind your target's movements by connecting your shadow with theirs. More so, the target's movements become a reflection of your own. Like this. Rimuru reached for his backside, grabbing onto nothing. Saoi's body double did the same, reaching for one of its blades and unsheathing it. There was a visible resistance seen through the minor shaking of its body, but otherwise, it perfectly mimicked Rimuru. Guided by Rimuru's actions, the clone brought the blade to its neck, slitting its own throat before bursting into smoke. "Most impressive," Saoi, the original, said in intrigue. He was already thinking of the various ways this technique could be used to subdue enemies, create openings, and even assassinate without leaving a trace. "Thank you, but the technique is not without its flaws. Firstly, as a shadow-based technique, it works best in the dark. Not only is it stronger then, but it requires a lot less magicules. In bright environments, it becomes a lot harder to sustain. And second, the amount of magicules used in keeping hold of your target depends on their strength," Rimuru explained. Saoi nodded in understanding, meaning, "It's a technique best used under the cover of darkness. It's not for prolonged restrictions against strong foes. Against powerful individuals, at best it can be used to create an opening, and at worst, stalling for time. It's still a resourceful skill, though, and with enough practice, you can even stretch the shadows in multiple directions, allowing you to bind multiple targets," Rimuru said, before asking Saoi to create another body double. The next skill could be considered a mere extension of the shadow possession. Rimuru's shadow once more stretched towards the clone, binding its movements, but it didn't stop there. The shadow then began to climb up the clone's body, traveling upwards along its skin, beneath its clothing, before reaching the neck where it took the shape of a hand. The clone began to choke, losing its ability to breathe from the pressure. Shortly after, a sickening cracking sound was heard, before the clone burst into smoke. This is called the shadow neckbending, a skill meant to make up for the shadow possession's lack of offensive power. It has the same limitations and weakness to light, and the pressure depends on the magicules focused into the technique. Meaning, it's less ideal for enemies with strong physical forms, Rimuru explained. He gestured for Saoi to make one more body double. This last technique is a bit more versatile than the first two, but it is equally more costly depending on how you use it. Once more, Rimuru extended his shadow. But this time, Rather than going all the way to the double, 7 tendrils of darkness sprouted from the ground halfway through. All 7 tendrils pierced the body double on several parts of its body, instantly dispelling it in another burst of smoke. The tendrils lingered for a moment longer, swaying at Rimuru's whim, before they sank back into the shadow. And that was the shadow stitching skill. It's basically the physical manifestation of shadows in the three-dimensional world. Because it's the manifestation of darkness, it is much weaker in the light, but in dark areas or under the cover of night, it's far more efficient and less taxing. Rimuru turned to the group. This is all I have for you today. Each of these skills are useful in their own right. Given that most of you already have shadow movement, you should be able to acquire these 3 quite easily with some guidance. For the next few hours, Rimuru taught them the techniques. Saoi, as expected, got a handle on all 3 in a short amount of time. The guy was just that skilled. To be good-looking and naturally talented. Rimuru didn't envy Saoi, but he did envy his confidence and ability to remain calm in all situations. The others had to put in a bit more effort, with most of them only getting 1 or 2 at best. But Rimuru was still impressed. Looking at the sky, Rimuru noted the crimson glow of the sun as it went over the edge of the horizon. It was getting dark. Rimuru sent Saoi to gather the rest of his people, giving him a moment alone. The birth of a creator. Notice, the unique skill, creator, has been acquired by the individual Rimuru Tempest. Wait, what? The sudden announcement by Great Sage was almost enough to throw Rimuru off balance. The unique skill, creator, possesses the following subskills: material creation, which allows the user to create matter by expanding magicules, and skill creation, which allows the user to manipulate spiritual energy to create any skill or ability they desire. What the hell, Great Sage? Where is this even coming from? Rimuru was completely lost. Creator sounded like a broken skill in any universe. The ability to create any object or skill he wanted was absurd. Answer: it can be surmised that your desire to create a peaceful nation, as well as your creation of new botanical life forms and skills not known to this world, are what attributed to you acquiring this unique skill. I guess that makes sense. Honestly, Rimuru wasn't sure. There wasn't a strict criteria for awakening unique skills, but naturally acquiring one was usually limited to desire and merit. Perhaps the voice of the world thought differently. Still, he wasn't one to refuse such a gift. It was an absurd power, though he did have one other concern. Great Sage, please try to show some restraint. Great Sage was already turning into something of a skill maniac, shuffling and merging skills whenever it pleased. Rimuru didn't want to know what kind of crazy ideas it could come up with when it had access to a skill like Creator. Understood, please leave it to me. That kind of response doesn't reassure me, Rimuru deadpanned. Yes. And now it was quiet. Rimuru mentally sighed. He trusted Great Sage with his life, but he wanted to be at least kept up to date on any major actions it took. He didn't want to be completely reliant on his partner. He had to be competent enough so that the sage wasn't pushing itself to cover his flaws. Lord Rimuru, Saoi's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. The Kijin and his division were on one knee in front of him. Sorry, had some thoughts running through my head. Most of you have already made some progress today, but before I leave, there is one more thing that I should address, and one more item I want to give you. Rimuru went over the faces of each person present. The path that you've chosen is arguably the hardest and most morally gray, Rimuru stated, his face flattening into an emotionless expression. To be a spy, an assassin, means to take risks that very few ever do. It means dwelling in the heart of the enemy or staining your hands with countless lives, all while the common folk never hear of your merits. My lord, Saoi was cut off when Rimuru raised his left hand. I'm not one to pass judgment casually. I value the lives of all those under me. That being said, it doesn't change the fact that your lives will mostly exist in the shadows. All I say is that I'm aware, and that I appreciate what you have done, and will do. Rimuru felt their spirits lift slightly. He wasn't sure how far into the darkness he may have to ask them to go, but if he could avoid trading a subordinate soul for the so-called greater good, he would take any other alternative. On a lighter note, I believe I said I had one more token for all of you. Rimuru stretched out his hand. From his stomach, he manifested a long table covered in dozens of similarly designed masks. These are concealment masks. As the name suggests, they are designed to hide all traces of one's presence and your identity. The mask is fitted with anti-magic, sound absorption, and scent concealment, making whoever wears it virtually undetectable by conventional means. "My lord, we're not deserving of such a rare gift," Saoi said as they bowed their heads. "Maybe, but you're getting them anyway. They'll serve you well out there." Saoi was the first to stand. He took a mask and put it on. Almost instantly, the mask adapted. A hole appeared on the forehead for Saoi's horn, and blue and gray lines decorated the surface. Notice, the individual Saoi's presence has been completely concealed. Rimuru could tell. His aura was gone. His scent was gone. Rimuru couldn't even sense his intentions. The only reason Rimuru could sense him at all was because of ultra instinct. He doubted many people would have such an ability. One by one, the others took their masks. As they put them on, the masks underwent unique transformations suited to their personalities. "Looking good," Rimuru said with a nod. Looking at them now, he felt like he was looking at an ANBU or Ninja Corp. "Lord Rimuru," surprisingly, it was Sauka who spoke up. The daughter of the Lizardmen chief had risen to become Saoi's second in command. "Please allow us to thank you for your teachings, as well as the gifts you have bestowed. We will do our best to live up to your expectations." Rimuru wanted to tell them not to push themselves too hard, but he knew those words would fall on deaf ears. "Just do your best, that's all I would ask of you." "Understood,"